Well, welcome everybody. Really excited to have you here today on our webinar. It's a beautiful spring morning here in California. I hope it's a lovely spring day wherever you are and whatever time it is for you. We talked about doing this, trying to do it out in an orchard, logistics and stuff made that difficult, but I did bring a piece of my orchard here today to show you what an almond looks like right now growing on the tree. You can see they're about full size, haven't split the holes yet, but excited to talk to you more about sustainability and the California almond industry, important initiatives underway here, and how this helps and aligns with important things for CPGs and the food industry. So if I want to introduce who we're talking to today, who I am, and my colleague Dan here. But first, real quick about the Almond Board of California, who I work for and is organizing this webinar. The Almond Board is what's known as a federal marketing order, but importantly, we represent all of California's almond farmers. There's 7,600 farmers, 100 processors, and anyone who grows or sells almonds in California is represented by the board. We take a grower assessment and then reinvest that into things that support the industry. And that remit has changed over time. It's gone from kind of quality, consistency, food safety, to addressing pest problems and helping growers agronomically, to understanding the nutrition of almonds, to today really focusing on global trade and market access issues, building demand for almonds. So we really represent and can speak to the entire almond industry here in California. A little bit about me. You can see here from the slide, I'm a third generation almond farmer. I will probably say almond as well, which is how farmers say it, depending where you grow. But we'll talk more about that coming up. And then I also am the sustainability lead at the Almond Board of California. I've been here for coming up on 12 years now and have worked across research, communications, and now leading up sustainability holistically and working closely with Dan. So Dan's somebody who has deep roots in this industry. So Dan, if you want to introduce yourself and your role here as well.
Yeah, good morning, Danielle. Although I suppose we should say good afternoon or good evening to some members of our audience. So it's great to be here with you talking about one of our favorite subjects, right? Almond sustainability. I'm Dan Sonke. I head sustainability programs at one of the approximately 100 almond processors and handlers in California, Blue Diamond Growers. But I'm also here in my capacity today as the chair of the Environmental Stewardship Working Group, which is one of the working groups within the Almond Board of California structure that's advancing the work on sustainability and agricultural science. So happy to be here with you talking about this today. As we said, I do have roots in the industry. So I grew up on an almond farm, just like you. Although, unlike you, I don't live on the farm today. It is still in the family, but I was the geeky kid who wasn't going to be a farmer, but said I can use science and sustainability to help to foster the rural community that I grew up in and I still love. And so that's how I have spent my career, 30 years now, working in sustainable agriculture across a wide number of crops. But 4 years now with Blue Diamond, and prior to that, I was at 10 years at one of the large CPG food companies. So working on sustainable agriculture and food innovation in that role. We can talk about that more today. Before we go any further, I just want to invite the audience. If you have comments or questions, there is a Q&A tab that is, I think it's under our videos, our video feed, and you can put your questions and answers there, and we'll get to those later, and we're eager to do so. There's also some documents there on the screen that you can access directly, and we encourage you to do that, and we'll reference those again later. So with that, in my role as a CPG expert, I've been able to watch the rise of consumer interest in sustainability in food. So we have some facts on the screen here that came from a recent Innova report, so 2025. 1 in 2 consumers globally are aware of the impacts of climate change. And I want to emphasize globally. I started my career in international ag many years ago. It is also fascinating to watch the global rise of middle classes and the change in interest in sustainability that comes along with that. In the middle here, 3 in 4 consumers agree that companies should be more efficient in their use of natural resources. This is not surprising to those of us who've worked in the food industry. A little bit more surprising, perhaps, is this third one, 64% growth in the launch of products with regenerative agriculture claims between 2018 and 2023. I referenced just today another resource that I've used over the years too. Similar numbers in the United States, 77% of consumers are already aware of the term as of 2023. And that was a 20% growth over 2 years earlier when they did the same research. So really rapid growth and awareness of folks about regenerative agriculture as a term and a concept. And so we are aware that consumers and companies are responding to this growth in awareness and demand. And we're here today to talk about how almonds can lean into that.
Exactly. Thanks, Dan. And I think there's a lot of good examples, even in that space, of things that the almond industry has already been working on. May not have called it that in the past, but we'll make sure to mention that as we go through and talk about important initiatives underway. So before we dig into the kind of the heart of the sustainability initiatives that the industry is focused on, I wanted to give some background about the industry and just characterize that a little bit. So with the California almond industry, family farms really are the norm. There's, like I said earlier, 7,600 farmers, 100 processors. Those are largely family farms. That we know that over 90% of almond farms are family farms, many of them third and fourth generations that plan to pass it down to future generations. We also know that about 70% are 100 acres or less. You can compare that to the average US farm size, which is 466 acres. These are generally small family farms. You do have variation in scale. There are larger farms. To give some context, generally you need to be 200 to 300 acres to make your entire income on almonds. So you can think of many of the industry, that 70%, will be diversified. So they might have other crops, other agricultural businesses, or have like a day job. So my family has 40 acres. We fall into that realm. We have another agricultural business. I have my own orchard, but I have a day job here at the almond industry or at the Almond Board. So when you think about this industry, it's really made up of kind of farms like Dan and I grew up on. But, we know that all different size farms have different advantages, different things that they bring to the table, and, great things happening on all of them. Dan and I wanted to spend a second just showcasing kind of our farms and how we grew up. The photos here on the left-hand side are of my family. My dad, brother, and I. In the top picture, we're actually loading up cover crop seed that is planted between our tree rows. My family, we first bought the property that we farm on. My grandpa and grandma and a great aunt and uncle bought that in 1965. They planted their first orchard then. You can see my grandma actually in the bottom photo near the logo, admiring the beautiful bloom. My grandpa thought she looked really pretty that day, so I needed to take a photo. Bloom is a great time to take photos in the orchard. And then my grandma's in the photo next to me. You can't really see it. We had planted our most recent orchard there. That was last summer. Or last spring. We're on our third orchard. Orchards generally last 25 years. Passing the farm on to future generations and ensuring that we farm responsibly is really important, both because our orchards are generational, but it's just really important to us to honor that legacy as well. So I see, Dan, you have a fun photo in bloom as well with some kids in trees.
Yeah, that's my siblings and I. Actually, there's one sibling that hadn't been born yet when that photo was taken, and that is the farm I grew up on. It is the farm my mother grew up on as well. So similar story. My grandparents bought that farm in 1958, I believe, and so I grew up in there. It's still in the family. It's now my uncle and my cousins live there. And my parents have their own orchard that's in another location nearby. And so they are still in the farming business, but they are mostly retired, and my brother farms it. I think it's a great kind of example of the close-knit rural community structure that you and I both appreciate. If we point out the fact that we grew up about, 10, 15 miles apart. Obviously, I'm a little bit older than you, but when we met each other through our professional work with the Almond Board of California, we discovered that I actually know your grandmother, and I still chat with her from time to time when I'm visiting my hometown. And we discovered later that our parents are still in the same bowling league together. Yes. So we have these family community connections that really, I think, speaks to the rural community, the family farm community that we're talking about today. And I think you and I both cherish that about working in this industry.
Absolutely. And, one of the stats I'm going to show on the next slide is about how we grow 80% of the world's almonds. This is a big industry. It's the world's largest producer of almonds, but at the end of the day, these are still small communities and families that make up who this industry is. So transitioning to that, about the industry, you can see here where almonds are grown globally. Generally happens in Mediterranean climates. That's the type of environment that almonds need to thrive. There are 5 of them around the world. California is one of them, and that's why we grow almonds here. If we have challenges related to those Mediterranean climates, they can have extremes in terms of droughts or floods, but we're committed to doing so in the right way because we're really proud of the nutritious food that we grow. And so we'll talk more about that and being responsible with our natural resources coming up here soon. But to Dan's point, even about community, agriculture is really the backbone of California. We grow over 350 different crops here. Almonds are one of them. They're an important contributor to jobs and communities in the state. So the almond industry generates 110,000 jobs in California, 102,000 of which are in the Central Valley. That's an area that chronically has had high unemployment. So a really important part of our state and, these really vibrant small communities that you have in California that you don't necessarily have elsewhere, or you kind of have smaller towns that are going away. The other thing that sets the California almond industry apart, I think, is the regulatory side. We have very strict rules that we follow on top of U.S. Ones, and I know Dan can speak to that more from a high-level perspective, but from a farmer perspective, we're working on things and complying with things with regard to worker safety, food safety, environmental safety. Farmers spend a lot of time on their computers, reporting and monitoring and that kind of stuff. It's an important part of how we farm.
That's right, Danielle. I speak to a lot of stakeholders from customers around the world, and it is often surprising to them to hear that California's regulations are separate and above and beyond the U.S. in general. So, yeah, to your point, worker heat protections, shade protections, access to hygiene facilities, clean drinking water. On the pesticide side, we have our own California Environmental Protection Agency that has its own pesticide registration process that is much stricter than the federal guidelines. And so farmers live in this environment. There are also very strict enforcements of these regulations in California to enforce them. So that sets it apart. And then I'll also just mention real quick that almonds are also mechanically harvested, so the labor requirements are quite low in spite of these regulations. So again, something that customers are often surprised to learn.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. And as we think of the with that size of the industry, we really understand the responsibility that comes with that. So this is a little bit more about the Almond Board and the type of programs that we fund with that grower investment, which are really in the research space. So understanding how to deal with pests. That's actually the start of our research programs at the Almond Board in 1973. Was to address and deal with kind of the major pests in the industry. But those programs have evolved to address water issues, air quality, improving how we harvest, pollination, keeping bees safe, expanded the environmental space, understanding our impact and our footprint, added on research about almonds and nutrition in the 1990s, understanding their impact on us as we eat them, how they benefit us. So research is really at the core of the Almond Board and helping guide the industry. And not only do we do the research, but we really focus also on making that research into tangible guidelines that growers can use on their farm. Published paper is good, but a grower doesn't have time to sit down and read all the published literature and try to triangulate what that means. So we really work with researchers and board staff to put those into guides that growers can use on the farm and get those out there, hosting workshops, that kind of stuff. And so going back to Dan's role, actually, he leads up the environmental stewardship work group with me. And so we fund and invest in research to really help quantify and understand the industry's impact, how we can improve those things. So I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to add anything about that role. It's a newer group that we have, but we're really excited about what that's doing for the industry.
Yeah, just this morning I was reviewing materials for our group, but also for another research committee, and it's just always exciting to see that we're looking 3 to 10 years out to see what we can tackle to be proactive as an industry. And that example you gave of some of the research in the very first year of the Almond Board's existence resulted in a tool that's widely used today for biological pest control in the industry, pheromone disruption. So it really shows the long-term thinking that the Almond Board has fostered over the years.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to dive into kind of some key initiatives underway in the industry. But it's important to start with what we get for the cost of production, and those we need to recognize it's almonds, right? So what we get out of those things is a really healthy product, has a really strong nutritional profile. We can't talk about, CPGs and food manufacturers without recognizing the ingredients. And so almonds bring a lot of important things to the table. This talks about the nutrition per kind of per unit and how that compares to other foods. There's actually, if you go into the PDF tab that Dan referenced, this is part of an infographic that lives in there if you wanted to dig more into that. I believe the QR code brings you there as well. But it's important to recognize that about almonds, that we're talking about an ingredient here that's very versatile, has a lot of different forms available, and has a really long shelf life. So that's something that, when we think about sustainability, we want to put it in that context as well. And I know, Dan, from a CPG perspective, this is something you've, dealt with in terms of sourcing and ingredients.
Absolutely. Hey, first of all, it's just fun to work on a food product that's not junk food and has a healthy nutrition profile, but then also can marry the nutrition with the sustainability story. And we're eager to share more of that with you today. So I'm gonna start right here on the number one question that we get when it comes to almonds and sustainability, which is about water. We know we grow in a water limited environment, like I talked about earlier. It's a Mediterranean climate. But we also know that we want to keep growing plant-based foods. We need to eat more plants generally if we're going to eat and grow food and feed our growing population within planetary boundaries. This is the way to do it, with plants and plant-based foods, and especially high-protein foods. And that's what almonds are. But to answer the question about almonds and water, the water use and requirement for almond trees is really in line with other tree crops grown in the state. That's what you can see here on the chart. You can see that the nut crops are actually a bit higher than the fruits. The reason for that is actually biological. It has to do with how a tree grows those things. It's easier to produce a sugar. It requires less kind of photosynthesis cost to the tree. It takes more work to make a protein than it is to make a sugar. So that's why the nuts are on a slightly higher scale, but generally in line here with trees. And you have to remember, we're growing trees for 25 years, keeping them alive and healthy. It takes more water than, say, an annual plant that only grows for 3 months. But the industry is really committed to and has understood the need for water conservation for a long time. The images shown at the bottom of this slide here represent how we used to irrigate and how we irrigate today. And that is a transition from flood irrigation, where we used to put water across the entire field, whether via flood or kind of big kind of lawn type sprinklers. And what we use today is micro irrigation. So you can see pictured here, micro sprinklers. Farmers also use drip, that are just little drip emitters. Both of them much more precise and allow farmers to conserve water. We know about 85% of the industry uses micro irrigation. We continue to see that number increase as the industry replaces orchards. You can't replace an irrigation system midlife of an orchard. So as orchards are replaced, farmers generally are upgrading that technology. And as a result of that change and shift in practice in terms of irrigation technology, we know that farmers reduced the amount of water used to grow each almond by 33% between the 90s, kind of when that technology was starting to be adopted,
and the 2010s. And that adoption was really fueled by Almond Board research that put those irrigation systems, which were new in the 1980s, into practice and showed how they can benefit farms and not negatively impact yields. It's really important with 25-year orchards that we're not that we're really careful in what we recommend to growers, and we've thoroughly tested that before they invest in it and do it for 25 years. And the almond industry continues to focus in this area. Conservation is really important. There's a goal actually that the industry's been working towards an additional 15% by 2025. Well on their way to that, because again, we know that growing in a water limited environment, we have to conserve. But another important thing to think about when it comes to water is that almonds, and actually I'll get out my little prop here, they grow inside of a hull and a shell. Let's see, I need to bring it into camera here. And these things are part of what the water grows, the hull, the shell, and the tree itself. All of those things historically have been put to use. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. But specifically, for example, the hulls, the fuzzy outer part, those are used exclusively for dairy feed in California. We can say about 100% of those go to California dairies, and that reduces the amount of water needed to grow feed crop for dairies. We've quantified that at 440 billion gallons of water that is not needed to grow something else that's just a byproduct of this industry. That's equivalent to 4 million US households annual water use. So that's a big component and something that we recognize. Also with water though, it's not just about conservation, it's about increasing and replenishing supplies. And so there's an approach that we started researching in as the Almond Board in around 2014, groundwater recharge, which is using our fields to replenish underground aquifers. And in California, water comes from both aquifers and surface water supplies in terms of winter snow, winter storms, and snowpack that melts throughout the year. And this is really important as we think of both climate change, which is going to make our climate extremes more extreme, where we might have more droughts, but also more flood years and years with a lot of precipitation. But this is also tied to, I'm sure you've heard of SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California, which is regulating California's groundwater. So this is an important tool and way that farmers are working to be part of the solution by adopting this on their farms. How it works practically is those excess winter flood flows from big storms that can't be captured in reservoirs. There's too much. Those are put out onto farm fields when the trees are dormant, when it doesn't hurt them. Again, part of that research in terms of not negatively impacting the orchards, and then percolates down and replenishes the aquifers, which benefits not just farms, but the local communities as well.
It's fun to watch the Almond Board research really facilitated the state of California being able to recognize and permit this process as a solution that agriculture can contribute to help recharge our aquifers. And now we see from the governor on down, the state is promoting this practice, which is exciting.
Exactly. And it's a key way that the state is going to come into compliance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So we've worked with other crop groups to help them understand what this looks like, an important part of California's water sustainability story. Going back just to the co-products, the hull, shell, and the tree, I talked about the hulls, which are used traditionally as dairy feed. The shells get used as livestock bedding. Historically, the wood was used actually in cogeneration to create electricity. But something that we're doing, those are all good uses, and it's an important way that we can get more mileage out of the water used to grow almonds. But something that we've been doing is innovating when it comes to our co-products and working to kind of prime the market for new ways that we can use almond co-products. So whether it's the hulls, the shells, or the woody biomass, these photos are some examples of using hulls potentially as a food ingredient. This is working with a food technologist in the Bay Area. You can see a coffee replacement. There's kind of a tea example, bread. There's a kind of a performance bar here. But there's some other great examples with regard to the wood being used potentially for textiles, the shells in strengthening upcycled plastics. So some really exciting stuff happening here. And I don't know, Dan, if you tasted these foods. I've tried the tea and I really liked it. It's kind of a black tea taste that has some like floral and fruity notes to it. But just really cool to see what the industry is doing in this space and kind of leadership in the circular economy.
Yeah, I've tasted the coffee substitute. I'm not a coffee snob, but I found the flavor profile to be fruity and complex, and I thought even a coffee snob could get behind this. It really was interesting.
Definitely. So I want to bring us out to the farm without bringing us outside right now. But these are some videos from my farm, actually, and some cover crops that I've planted to bring to life kind of how farmers are working to support biodiversity and support honeybees and pollinators. There's a lot of different seed mixes that farmers can use. We can plant these either between the tree rows, like I've talked about, or in kind of fields adjacent to orchards, like you can see in this video here. But this is a really key way and something that we've been seeing the industry increasingly adopt. Farmers can generally get seeds discounted or for free from different organizations. And this is something that we know is really important as we think about the environment and kind of key initiatives in this space. These are mine actually from last year. Right now I have growing out in my farm a mix of daikon, triticale, and vetch, which provide benefits and nutrition both for pollinators, beneficial insects. I have a lot of ladybugs and lacewings out there, which are great. But they also provide benefits for me in terms of like water infiltration and reducing compaction on the farm. So here's some stats about this and how this practice comes to life in the industry. We know that 86% of all US bee-friendly certified farms, which is through the Pollinator Partnership, they're the certifier on this, are almond farms here in California. And cover crops is a key way that farmers achieve that certification. So we're really proud of that, and in terms of the adoption and increasing planting of cover crops on farms. And beyond that, though, these ones that are designed for pollinators and have the specific benefits, we know that a large portion of the industry maintains native cover between their tree rows, and those two generally will have some blooming things in them as well and provide and support biodiversity on the farm. But also it's important to recognize and talk about not just those wild pollinators that are out there that we're working to support, but honeybees are an essential part of growing almonds. They are essential to pollinating our crop. They get their first food source of the year in our orchards from both the blooms, and those cover crops help give them diversity in their diet. We know that they consistently leave stronger than when they arrived. In terms of biodiversity and kind of pollinator health globally, we know that pollinators, wild pollinators are really struggling. So this is a key way that we are helping to support and address that issue. Honeybees generally, their health levels in the US or the hive levels have been steady. We know there are some concerns this year that researchers are working to understand. We stand ready as the Almond Board to help address those issues. We've been funding honeybee health research since 1995 because they are a key part of how we grow. Every single almond that is on a tree exists because a bee pollinated it. So we are very vested in their health and their safety and doing what we can to support them on our farms. So the last piece that I wanted to cover in terms of a high-level theme area is carbon. And we have to come back to the fact that not all consumers or people out there know that almonds grow on trees. And trees are really important for creating oxygen, that kind of stuff, but they also sequester carbon dioxide. And they're a key way that actually the state of California, the existence of our orchards, is accounting for that and working using that as a key way that the state is going to achieve its greenhouse gas reduction goals. Our trees in California, our orchards holistically in the state, collectively have captured and stored 30 million metric tons of carbon, which is just a number. It's a large number. What does that mean? It's important to put that in context. So 30 million metric tons is equivalent to about 3,000 Boeing 737s. You can think of that as kind of the world's 4 largest airlines. They generally together have about 3,000 planes around that size, or 4.5 million vehicles. That's around the same number of cars in California, Oregon, Washington, and Texas combined. The annual emissions of those things is what our trees capture and store. So it's a really big impact. It's something that is important to recognize. But we also know when it comes to carbon, you can't just look at the sequestration. You have to also look at the emissions, the kind of cradle to grave emissions over the lifespan of the product and everything that goes into growing it. We do that through LCAs, life cycle assessments. We have done 2 LCAs on California almonds. The data that's shown here is from the most recent one that we have in 2020. And you can see where almonds stack up compared to other common food products. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to speak to this from your sourcing perspective, but generally almonds have a very low carbon footprint.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, innovation teams are looking for ingredients that have that intersection of nutrition and a good sustainability profile. And so this is a great starting point where we've got a low carbon footprint to start with. And so we want to highlight that. But we also want to acknowledge there's things that we can do to make that even better. And so next, I think we're going to talk about some things that we've found that can help with that, starting with whole orchard recycling.
Absolutely. So this is another video from my farm, actually kind of a sad day for me when we removed our trees. So this was my family's second orchard that we had. And this is a new practice that was pioneered in the almond industry by both an almond farmer and a researcher who kind of saw a problem and opportunity and really has dedicated his research career to understanding this technique and introducing it to the industry to the point where it has been pretty widely adopted in the short time that it has been out there and understood. So the practice is called whole orchard recycling. You can see here our trees, they get removed at the end of their 25-year lifespan generally. At that point, the inputs no longer match the outputs in terms of production. What used to happen is the trees would get chipped up, shipped off for cogeneration where they create electricity. But what we do now through this practice is grind them up, and you can see them being spread back on a field. They get disked into the soil, and what that does is that further captures and sequesters and stores that carbon, locks it out of the atmosphere. And this is the single most impactful carbon storage approach and process that we know of in agriculture. It's something that we think there's an opportunity for really in perennial crops. You have to do some research to understand and make sure it's not going to have negative impacts, cause any disease issues in subsequent farming approaches, but we're really seeing benefits in terms of the farm side. And that's what I've described here, as well as, like I said, additional carbon sequestration. On the carbon side, for every acre that we do this in, there's 2.4 tons of carbon that is captured and locked out, of the atmosphere to be emitted. That's equivalent to living car-free for a year for every acre. It's important to note that our LCA, our most recent LCA, does not include this practice. This was introduced in 2017. So by the time it was really getting out there into the industry, it hadn't been adopted enough to be accounted for in that. We expect that with this practice and further adoption of it, the industry would move from that low carbon footprint potentially into a neutral space, something that we need to understand and get metrics on. But there's really big potential here, both for our industry and we think for other crops like this. And farmers like it because it has benefits for us. We see that it increases soil organic matter. It increases our water holding capacity, which means that we can kind of wait longer between irrigations. The soil holds on to the water better. And important for farmers, it's been shown to increase yields in subsequent orchards because it's making more nutrients available and having some benefits like that for the farm. So we've seen that since this practice was introduced in 2017, of the orchards that have been replaced over that time, we believe about half have been using this technique, and we expect that to continue to increase and continue to impact, the impact of the industry. So I'm going to wrap up here with just some key initiatives and analyses that we have underway. This is kind of in the area that Dan and I work in and lead up for the organization. But some key areas that we're working on is to improve the data and the methodology behind water footprint research, and specifically using almonds as an example. So this is the traditional blue, green, gray water footprint, but we think there's some ways that methodology can be optimized using OpenET data. So using real-time actuals for water instead of just water demand, kind of theoretical numbers. We also think that the concepts of substitution is really important here, just like with LCAs. When you offset the impact of another industry, getting credit for or accounting for those credits in your LCA and having two sets of numbers is something we think water footprints can do. We're going to be coming up with some new numbers for almonds, as well as putting that in the context of California crops. So this is some research that we're working to get started right now. There are some analyses we have underway of, we have a program in the industry called CASP, the California Almonds Stewardship Platform, where growers can self-assess their practices. About 50% of the industry's acreage is represented in that database for us. And so looking at those practices and what the industry currently does, we're partnering with Sure Harvest, which is our administrator on that program, to understand the current adoption of regenerative practices, like we kind of talked about at the beginning, cover crops, whole orchard recycling. There's a lot of things the industry already does. So we're looking at key or common definitions of regenerative that are out there between California Department of Food and Ag, Region Score, SCI platform, and comparing the industry adoption of practices that align with those definitions to see where the industry stands, where we have opportunity to continue to educate and extend and understand those spaces. We're also doing a regulatory analysis, trying to put actual quantification and stats and numbers behind the things that California, just farming in California already addresses. To Dan's point about those California standards that we have, there's some things that we don't ask about in our CAS platform because it's assumed you do them, because you comply by California laws, and to farm here, you must do those things. So putting some data and stats on those is something we're working on. And then more broadly, we're working to engage in the sustainable nutrition space. This is an area that's really led up by the EAT Commission, the EAT Lancet. They came out with their first report in 2019. They're coming out with another one later this year. And we want to understand the opportunities here, but also to engage in that space from a research perspective. Updated and accurate water information for California almonds is a key to that. So that water footprint research you see, but also getting updated LCA data, some strong biodiversity metrics, which we currently don't have holistically for the industry, and updating economic and community impact metrics is going to be key to engaging in that space. But in the long term, we are looking to solicit some research in that area and really analyze how almonds stack up in that space.
Yeah, so as we wrap up, why don't you walk us through some of the resources that we have for our audience, and then we can get to our questions.
That's right. So a few things here that are, I think, in the PDF tab as well. But we have a carbon footprint fact sheet that details the most recent numbers from our LCA. So if you're working on Scope 3 compliance, there are real numbers right there from our 2020 analysis. So that's something that could be of use to you. The infographic that we kind of walked through, that's available in several different formats using the QR code here. And then just our website, almonds.com/growinggood or almondsustainability.org has more details in this space, but we're really excited to get to the Q&A section, so we will transition into that.
Thank you, Danielle. All right. Thanks, everybody, for contributing questions so far. There are some that have come in, so Danielle, let's just start with one that came in early.
Great.
Does the carbon footprint information you shared factor in transportation, which I think this might be a relevant question to help us heavily exported?
Yes, absolutely. So our life cycle assessment for almonds accounts for obviously the kind of cradle to grave of our inputs. So all the way from creating, say, the nitrogen fertilizer to moving water around the state, through the production, what we do on farm, and it goes up to what we call brown skin almonds. It's actually what's on the Q&A slide here. And so that's the end of our processing side as almond farmers and handlers. So it doesn't account for the transportation to their destination, but we do know that almonds, because they have such a strong shelf life, are perfectly suited to transportation by boats. And we know that the carbon footprint of that is significantly less. I believe it's 50 times less than by air. So almonds don't have or contribute in that way. But we know that generally when a supplier does their own life cycle assessment or their own accounting, they're looking at their transportation because that can vary by the source.
Yeah, I just reiterate that the vast majority of almonds are exported via ship, has one of the lowest transportation footprints that we can utilize. And for most food products, that tends to be the smallest, one of the smallest parts of the actual footprint. So not, we still want to get more data on the answer for this, but from what we know today, that's what we can share.
Exactly.
Okay, looking at some of the other questions that have come in. Ed asked a question about research on separated almond shell waste and innovative recycle reuse non-food applications. You touched a little bit on this earlier, but you and I were at a meeting yesterday where some information about this was shared at the Almond Board offices. So you want to maybe touch on some of that?
Yeah. So, if we want to backtrack, the Almond Board really started investing some energy into this space, probably in the 2015, 16, 17, founded a biomass working group, just like we have the environmental stewardship work group that's looking at all kinds of different opportunities here. And it had focused initially on research. And now we're really looking at things that have market opportunity and market potential demand for it. So one of the early things that was researched with regard to shells specifically was grinding them up, putting them through a torrefication practice that gets them to kind of a charcoal-like material and using them as a way to strengthen post-consumer recycled plastics. There's opportunities, we think, for biochar, for biofuels. I don't know, Dan, if you want to speak to some of the other examples we heard yesterday, everything from if you want to go to a kind of not direct food use, you can feed some of the hulls to algae that can grow different things. There's so much potential in this space, not just in the food area. And I think this is exciting for all of agriculture because we all have co-products or byproducts in some way that I think there's opportunity to replace things that are purpose grown right now. Another example that, sorry, Dan, I'll let you chime in, but another example that I got really excited about, and I actually contributed some wood from my orchard that was removed to this, was testing the idea of using that wood pulp to create textiles. So we have some research ongoing at UC Riverside to create kind of a plant-based textile. This is associated with kind of a big outdoor company, some research coming out of them because they have a goal to create more fabrics using byproducts specifically. So we think there's just a lot of opportunity there. I don't know, Dan, which ones stuck out to you from the presentation yesterday?
Well, it was kind of fascinating to me. I guess it was more the hulls than the shells, but the as you said, using microbes to convert some of the components of the hulls to oil and fat replacements that could be used in either cosmetic or fuel or even potential food uses. So that was kind of fascinating to me from a fermentation standpoint. The other kind of aha thing was just the advantage that we have in our byproducts is one of the same advantages we have in the almond itself, in that it is very easily stored at room temperature in dry conditions for a long time. So we have basically a 2-year shelf life with almonds if they're stored in cool, dry conditions, which actually I think is another question that came in. And then, but the byproducts themselves are also dry, which lends them to byproduct manufacturing processes because you don't have to very quickly use them or they will spoil. And for that reason, it's also attractive as a supply resource for other industries that can use these byproducts.
Yes, and just a reminder, I was just going to remind people, drop your questions into the Q&A. We can actively see these as they're coming in. Dan, I was thinking we could answer, there's one about organic almond production and kind of what that looks like in California. This is a question we get asked pretty commonly. It's something that is, I would say, it's challenging for farmers to do in California, and not just in California, but almond production itself. And Dan, I know you have some thoughts and experience here as well. I believe the stat is around 1% of production, something like that. You actually asked me, Dan, for the latest stat on this. So if you remember that, that would be great. But we do know that it's really challenging to provide the nitrogen needed to grow almonds via the organic standards, because you can't use synthetic nitrogen sources in that. And almonds being such a high protein food, nitrogen is the key component to creating that in the tree and to powering that process. So it's really a barrier and challenge for farmers. They can't achieve the yields that you need to basically make it work economically to grow almonds. I know there are some other challenges to it. So Dan, I know your role on the research committees at the Almond Board, I know you've got some experience here too.
Well, I think you answered it well. There are challenges in the production system. Some of the pests are, they hide inside the shell, so it's hard to address them from organic methods. But there is a market for it. There is a supply for it. But as you said, it's less than 2% of the California market, from what I understand. Let's see. Another question I wanted to tackle myself, I get this a lot too. How is the industry adopting regenerative practices? And of course, the definition of regenerative, there's no official definition out there. Lots of definitions are still coming into play, but as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of regenerative practices that we see fit in almond production, from cover cropping with its benefits for pollinators, soil, carbon, and even water resiliency in the soil, to whole orchard recycling, which has some of those same benefits, including microbial biodiversity in the soil. All these cool things that are happening from some of these practices that we've researched and started to adopt. What I'll say is that a lot of handlers are now incentivizing growers to adopt these practices, and we see customers responding to bring in funding for that. We see government programs that are increasingly funding these practices, and so there is adoption happening throughout the industry. Anything customers can do to help encourage that is always welcome.
And I would just add, Dan, anecdotally, it's really interesting. I've hosted tours on my farm and been talking about practices that we do, and then gotten the question of like, okay, so tell me about the regenerative practices that you use. So it's interesting the terminology and language around it. It may not be something that farmers use or think of, but a lot of these practices that are key to regenerative are happening in our orchards. So I mentioned a few slides ago in the presentation an analysis that we're doing of grower adoption of common regenerative practices. That's something that should be out later this summer, early fall. But even just the introductory work that I've done and the numbers that I've seen, we have really high adoption of those things. I think it's a question of stacking and, who's checking the box on all of those things together. But that's an area that we as the Almond Board are researching as well, in terms of those benefits of stacking and helping to quantify those things. Growers are in California, I think, very open to adopting new practices, but it's really helpful to have the data and statistics behind it, as well as for our own analysis, like how does that offset our impacts and how can that reduce our impacts? So having that data behind it is also very helpful and something that we're actively focused on. I believe we have at least 2 research projects ongoing in that space with UC Davis and other researchers.
All right, another question that came in, what will the water availability be in 10 years for almond growers in California? It's a very appropriate question. Yeah. We mentioned the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act earlier. You also mentioned some of the surface water systems that we have in California. And what I'll say is that I remind people again, almonds only grow commercially in the 5 Mediterranean climate zones around the world. And actually, California is the one that has invested most heavily in the surface water infrastructure, the surface water rights to protect access to water for farmers. And then California was criticized a little bit 10 years ago for waiting so long to put in groundwater protections, but now we have those groundwater protections, which are aimed at sustainability and groundwater management. And so, yes, while certain regions within California will shift the types of crops that they grow and the number of crops that they grow, it is still very clear that agriculture in general and almonds in general have a robust future in California, that these protections are already starting to do their job to protect the ability of California agriculture to thrive. And so in 10 years, we expect to have plenty of almonds to deliver to the world.
Yeah, and for those who might be more interested in this space and kind of shifting the impacts of Sigma and what that looks like in California, there's two studies, kind of leading studies that are out there, one by the Public Policy Institute of California, the other, the name is escaping me of the researchers, but they estimate between 500,000 and 750,000 acres of agricultural production will come out of production in California. That said, we're engaged in a lot of conversation with kind of environmental nonprofits, the states, of what are some ways, there's this term multi-benefit land repurposing. What are ways that we can use that land that may not be in agricultural production anymore, may not have that water, but for beneficial uses? When that land is just fallow, there are negative things that can happen on that land, more dust that is produced. There's other challenges related to that. So offsetting that is an important part of the conversation as well when it comes to water, and one to watch if you're interested in this space. I see, Dan, we have a related question from Antonio, or kind of related. How is almond production being impacted by climate change? It describes seeing some things with flowering sooner, risk of frost. Do we want to, I can talk through those a bit from a farmer perspective, what that looks like for me, and kind of just some thoughts on it. And Dan, if you want to chime in. So for almonds specifically, the concerns come in terms of those overwintering hours, what we call our winter chill hours. Perennial trees, all perennials need a certain, or deciduous ones that lose their leaves, need a certain amount of time in kind of dormancy to be able to wake back up and power the next year. And that's called your chill hour requirements. Every crop that loses its leaves and regrows them has them. Almonds actually have among the lowest chill hour requirements. I believe it's 600 hours that they need. So as we think of our winters getting warmer, which is one of the projections in California, almonds are at the least risk of that in California. I believe the projections are that almonds should be fine here. Also in the kind of winter time frame, it's projected that means the winters will be warmer. We don't have as much fog. And that fog is important for certain functions, kind of keeping the temperature down in the winter, especially during bloom. Really hot temperatures can cause what we call a flash bloom, where all the trees bloom really quickly all together. That can have good benefits, but also not as much because the pollen dries up quicker and that kind of stuff. So that's an impact. But I'd say the bigger impact comes to water and kind of the increased frequency of drought and heat waves. That's actually another topic that was discussed at a meeting Dan and I were at yesterday, and the kind of unknowns actually when we have these extended heat waves where it's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for several days in a row. We don't know exactly. It seems like the trees just kind of shut down like we would, right? Just like, I'm not doing any more work right now. But the long-term impacts is something that we're working to understand. And then also related to that, a bit beyond our orchards, but obviously impacting our orchards, is the water availability. And so in terms of drought, we know that just means less water in the system overall. That's something that impacts all farmers. With climate change, it's projecting that we'll have more intensity of droughts, but also on the flood side of things. So that's another thing to consider with California. Our water infrastructure in the state, which is highly designed, has been designed and being built since the gold rush in California as ways to store and move water across the state. That system was designed for winter snowpack, and then moving that water around the state as it slowly melts in the summer, or in the spring and summer, that snow. So with climate change, it's projected we're going to get around the same amount of precipitation, but more of it will be rain and less of it snow. So that system that's designed to slowly catch that melting snowpack isn't set up quite right anymore. And that's something that as a state, we need to grapple with. And, we're ready to have those conversations, but it's something much bigger than almonds.
Yeah, but it also, again, points to the importance of soil practices that can help to capture and hold that water and make those orchards more resilient to those variations and fluctuations. So well said. I was going to go to that same question, but you answered it brilliantly. So, all right, I think we have time for just maybe one more. Let's see, we've got some that are still coming in here. So thank you all for participating.
I see kind of a
question. One quick one. There, is there an opportunity to import almonds to India? Yes, there are many companies that supply from California to India already. So I'm sure you can find one. That's one of our big markets these days. Sorry, I interrupted you, Danielle. Do you have another one you want to go to?
I was just there's kind of a hard-hitting one here, or not a hard-hitting one, but one that we know is about a topic or a question people have a lot about the almond industry, which is water. How does water use compare to beef and broccoli on an ounce per ounce basis? Very specific question, and honestly, that's a question I've got too. So we talked a little bit a few slides ago about a water footprint research study that we're working to get off the ground. This is a space, and I'm sure those of you in the CPG world are aware of, there's lots of different ways you can slice and dice these numbers. There's different methodologies out there, whether it's the traditional blue, green, gray water footprint. We know the LCA methodology has 2 different ways you can assess that. And we know there's also ones like WRI, there's kind of private ones that are out there assessing it. So this is something we're trying to understand. It's honestly key also to the sustainable nutrition conversation, because that ounce for ounce also implies like, what's the nutrition of that thing? Because we also need to think about what do we get out of it, not just the environmental costs. But the cost is more than just water as well, right? We have to think about the carbon emissions, the land use, the energy required. There's a broad range of things to look at. So I don't have exact answers there. I can say generally growing a head of broccoli is less than an almond because it's an annual plant that has a shorter lifespan. We've seen that with the global water footprint data that's out there. Then you'd have almonds, then you would have beef, which is a big jump to that. But I think it's a question here for all of us as to the data and the methodologies that are used. How do we harmonize those things and use them and broaden the conversation, not just from water? I think that in itself is that cherry picking is a form of greenwashing. I think we have to be really careful when we're assessing the sustainability of things to look at all the factors.
I am very much looking forward to that research, and I've been enjoying reviewing the proposal with you. So thank you for that. I've enjoyed our conversation today, but we should probably wrap up and remind our listeners where they can get additional resources.
Yep. So I will do that. Thank you all so much for the questions. It's been great answering those. And just to kind of wrap up, if you have more questions for us, we are always here at the Almond Board. So the QR code there will put you in touch with ABC's Harbinder Mann, who leads up our relations with CPGs and food companies. My contact information is there as well, so you can reach out to us, but also really encourage you to reach out to your handler, your supplier of almonds. They know specifically about their growers, their practices, their Dan mentioned incentives about different practices and encouraging growers to do those. They'll be able to answer the specifics about their almonds. We're, of course, a resource, kind of the industry broadly and that stuff. But we'll all point you to the right person if you reach out, no matter who you reach out to. And then the QR code here at the end is just some additional resources on our website that are of service to you, in addition to what we've shared today. So thank you all. Thank you, Dan. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone.